Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Kirsten Ellenbogen, President and CEO of Great Lakes Science Center, a proud programming partner of the City Club of Cleveland. Today marks the City Club's second annual State of the Great Lakes. The program began last year as an effort by the City Club to focus on our collective attention on what is arguably the most important natural resource in our region. 1/5 of the world's fresh water, some 6 quadrillion gallons that reach our shores less than 1 mile from where I'm standing today. Last year, Mayor Tom Barrett from Milwaukee delivered this address as chair of the Great Lakes and St. Louis Cities Initiative. He reminded us of the impact that the lakes have on all of us. Our fresh freshwater coast, he said, defines our history and economy and has the potential to lift us out of the Rust Belt narrative that defined our last century. He also told us that the Great Lakes represent one of the few completely nonpartisan issues. It is important locally as it is at the state, national, and international levels. Our speaker today brings a different focus. Chris Korleski directs the Great Lakes program for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. That puts him at the heart of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which began in 2010 and includes more than 2,000 projects by 11 federal agencies. That budget, by the way, is $1.1 billion. Chris Korleski is no stranger to Ohio. He is the former director of the Ohio EPA, where he was instrumental in the work to delist Ohio rivers. And once upon a time, he was counsel to Honda of Ohio. But the real reason we are here today is because these lakes matter to our lives. The water on your table, or in the local craft brewed beer that you drink, came from Lake Erie. Through the Port of Cleveland, the lake touches thousands of jobs in our region and contributes hundreds of millions to our economy. And if economic projections pan out, freshwater technology will be a key part of our regional economic growth. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris Korleski for the City Club's second annual State of the Great Lakes.
Mic's on? Volume's good? Okay. With your indulgence, I'm going to stay away from the podium and wander around a little bit. I speak a little better when I do that. Don't worry, I will walk over here too, so I'm not going to cut you folks off. I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank the City Club. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. It is delightful to be back in my home state. I heard Jack Shaner's remarks about Cleveland, about being the big city. I grew up in Alliance, Ohio, about 60 miles southeast of here. It was a steel town, manufacturing town at the time. Cleveland to me as a kid was Rome. That's the only way to describe it. Came in last night, it was a beautiful evening. It was gorgeous, the lakefront. I see all the construction work, the cranes. Things are definitely happening in Cleveland, and I'm very excited. Who's LeBron James? In fact, I almost just gave up because why bother after that? All right, let's talk about the Great Lakes. And again, it is very good to be here. I'm not going to just talk about Lake Erie. I'm going to talk about all the lakes. And the topic of the talk is the state of the Great Lakes. And that could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But I'm going to use one word to categorize the state of the Great Lakes as of today, and that is energized. Chris, what in the world do you mean by energized? What does that mean? What I mean by that is just about everybody in this room, you wouldn't be here, I presume, if you didn't have an interest in the Great Lakes. Well, you are aware of a host of activities by many, many organizations that are trying to get things done in the Great Lakes. You are also aware, as my introducer just pointed out, that there's something called the GLRI, which has been, to say the least, and this is an understatement, a significant shot in the arm for Great Lakes remediation and restoration work. $475 million in 2010, roughly $300 million since then. I think yesterday that the House's budget includes $300 million for FY15. We'll see what happens for FY16. We'll see what happens for FY15, fiscal year 15. We don't know what the budget's going to be. But what that reflects, I think, is significant bipartisan support And how often do you hear the phrase bipartisan support these days? Perhaps not as much as many of us would like. But at any rate, there is a significant amount of investment by Congress, by the administration in restoring the Great Lakes. And not to sound too crass, but I often say this in my talks, when you're talking about environmental protection, it often comes down to two questions. How much, who pays? In many, many instances, that is what environmental protection boils down to. And that's unfortunate sometimes. That is the reality of what we're dealing with. So, energized because there is money, there is great activity, and I'm going to talk about the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. I'm going to talk about what we're doing in GLRI. And you know, here in Ohio, I think even in Ohio, now I'm in Chicago now, so I'm not as close to things here as I used to be, but I sense a lot of activity in the Lake Erie Basin, in the Western Basin, among so many constituents, including the ag constituency, the nonprofits, local communities, to say we have to do something about the algae problem on Lake Erie. One of the complaints that has, for a long time, existed about Great Lakes activities is, and I think former Senator Voinovich used to say this, if you look at everyone involved in the Great Lakes, it's like an orchestra, but there's no conductor. Because you had many, many organizations with good intentions wanting to do good things, but they all sort of had their own agenda. They all wanted to do their own things. Some were more local in scope, some were larger in scope. So it was difficult to keep track of that. That is still happening to a certain extent. I won't mislead you and say that there is now one totally cohesive, consolidated, and comprehensive system that's managing everything in the Great Lakes. But we're getting better. We're getting better at talking to each other. And that's very, very good. Now, what I want to talk about first, I want to talk about being enthusiastic and being energized. I'm going to talk about three technical areas. I didn't want to make this a technical talk today because that can be dry and boring and you've just had lunch and it's a Friday and everyone's tired and looking forward to the end of the weekend. So I didn't really want to do that. And frankly, I had meetings all morning this morning in Cleveland. It worked out well. I'm all sweaty and rumply and dumply, so I will all be ready to wrap this week up when it's over. But let's talk about a couple of substantive things. I'm going to talk about AOCs, areas of concern. I'm going to talk about algae, or nutrients, and I'm going to talk about invasives. I want to start with areas of concern because that is a topic that I think is probably most unfamiliar to people who may not spend a lot of time in the lakes. So areas of concern, there are 43 of them. There are 31 in the United States. There are 12 in Canada. They are a product of the 1987 version of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the United States and Canada. Basically, these are areas that were agreed upon by both states as being 43 of the most highly contaminated, toxic hotspots, if you will, in the Great Lakes watershed. Again, on both sides of the border, our good friends in Canada and on the United States. Now, let me tell you something. So that was 1987 or thereabouts. I'm going to ask you a question. Between 1987 and 2010, do you know how many of those areas of concern were cleaned up? And I'm going to use a word here, delisted. You're going to hear me talk about delisting, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. How many? This gentleman knows. One. And let me point out that cleaning up one AOC back between 1987, and that happened in 2006, not a very impressive track record, to say the least. That's the bad news. The good news is, largely because of GLRI funding, and let me paraphrase that, in 2009, the budget for the Great Lakes National Program Office was about $40 to $50 million. The following year, it was $475 million. That is a culture shift. That is an everything shift. To the point that my office, which has about 60 people in it, struggled to figure out, what do we do? How do we implement this? So the first year was bumpy, but it's gotten better. And to say the least, that is a huge capital investment. Largely because of that, since GLRI started in 2010, we've delisted, meaning taken it off the list. It's been removed from the list of toxic hotspots because there's been a tremendous amount of, depends on the AOC, area of concern, but it could be dredging work where you're trying to remove contaminated sediments. It could be you're trying to restore habitat to something more like a natural habitat. It can be removing factors that influence the fish, that make the fish taste funny, that make them unsuitable for diet. There are 14 things that can cause things to be on this AOC list, and I won't go into all that. But we did a second one in 2013, that was Presque Isle Bay, and we are, pardon my French, we are hell-bent for leather to get 2 more delisted by the end of the calendar year 2014, 2 in Michigan, a place called Deer Lake and a place called White Lake. And this is the good news, my boss, who, and if you know my boss, you know that she is no shrinking violet and is very ambitious, is dedicated, which means, therefore, that I'm dedicated, of course. I would have been anyway, but you know how it works. Dedicated to trying to not delist, but to, and I'm going to use the phrase here, complete the management actions at roughly half of the remaining AOCs. So that by the end of the calendar year 2016, we want to have the necessary work done that will get us to about halfway through that list of 31 American AOCs. That was unthinkable a few years ago. Absolutely unthinkable a few years ago that we would be making that kind of progress. So it is absolutely remarkable. Now, let me explain, because you may know, you are in an AOC right now, or you're very close to one. So again, these 43 hotspots include, for example, the Maumee Basin, the Maumee Watershed, Cuyahoga River, Black River, Ashtabula River. What does completion of management actions mean? So what you do when you're trying to clean up an AOC? Well, first you have to figure out, what do we have to do to clean up the AOC? Who's involved in that? Local folks, state folks, federal folks, tribal folks, if applicable. In further west, we have a lot of tribal involvement in these issues. And there's usually something called a PAC, a Public Advisory Council, made up of local people who truly steer the process. They work very closely with the state and the federal government, but you have that high degree of local involvement. And the first task is to figure out, what is the work we actually have to do to get this cleaned up? Again, it could include dredging. That's not that simple. You can't just say, well, we need to do some dredging. You need to figure out how much dredging. Where do you dredge? To the point of exactly where will the dredger go and where will it not go? You don't want to dredge clean sediment. Well, how do you know where the clean sediment is? Well, you sample. So you can imagine there's sampling work. There's just a tremendous amount of study that goes into this. You look at alternatives for getting it cleaned up. And ultimately, you figure out, you try to come to agreement on, okay, if we do these activities, A, B, C, whatever that is, we believe that is the work that will allow us to ultimately delist the AOC. And what do you do next? If you have the money, small step, but if you have the money, you do the work. When you're done with the work, you have completed management actions. Does that mean that you're ready to delist? No, and this gets lost on a lot of people. This completion of management actions, which is work, basically means we think we've done all the physical work necessary to let this AOC heal, so that within some, hopefully relatively short period of time, it will be just like every other area of the lake. Now there's a key point there. I just said just like every other area of the lake. No one is talking about, when you're talking about delisting an AOC, no one is talking about making that particular area the way it was back, say, in 1492. That is impossible. Or, if not possible, let's just say, and this is another understatement, it would be cost prohibitive to do that. The point of delisting AOCs is to take these exceptionally contaminated areas and generally return them to an area that is consistent with the rest of the lake that was not subjected to the same degree of legacy contamination. You hear us talk about legacy projects. That's what that means. You are cleaning up decades, perhaps a century, of legacy pollutants going back to the days before we had a comprehensive regulatory system like we do today. Because it is, unfortunately, a gift that keeps on giving. Those contaminants, as long as they're in the water, they will keep contributing PCBs or metals or PAHs or any other number of contaminants, which will continue to affect the smaller things in the food chain, the larger things in the food chain, all the way up. When you remove contaminated sediments from an area, you're giving that place a chance to clean up and restore itself. Sometimes the restoration can occur relatively quickly. Sometimes it can take years. But the point is, for us, while delisting is a wonderful accomplishment and celebration, you need to understand that that completion of management actions, that's what we're focusing so hard on, because that's the actual work. After that, one hopes that the lake will restore itself through attenuation. So again, folks, we are, pardon my French, we are hell-bent for leather to try to get the work done at as many of these AOCs can with GLRI funding. So it is an area of great success. It is an area where we are working literally as hard as we can. I torment my staff constantly for updates and how are we doing. I try to get out to the sites to see how we're doing. But the progress we are making is unthinkable, was unthinkable 10 years ago. Now, in Ohio, there are a number of AOCs. Excuse me, we're in one here. Let me go back to something that's very, very important. In order to get an AOC delisted, one of the things that has to be done is ultimately there needs to be an agreement about, okay, given the best science we have, working with local partners, state partners, federal partners, agency partners, and GLRI is not being implemented solely by EPA. Let me be very upfront about that. It is a multi-federal agency program. The Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Coast Guard, just about everybody is involved in this. So it is very much a federal partnership. Again, this is part of that, the orchestra actually, maybe not the entire orchestra, but now we have a string section with a concert master. And that's getting better. That's getting better. That's a really bad analogy, but you know what I mean. So you have to agree on that. And that's not easy. And the direction that I am giving to states now, including Ohio, not the direction, but the advice, the very strong advice I'm giving them is, in order to get in the chain for AOC funding, one of the things that we look at very closely is, has there been agreement on this list of management actions? Because if there isn't, if people are still arguing back and forth about, well, do we need to dredge that, or do we need to do habitat work? What that basically means is, okay, we're not really ready to fund anything yet because we haven't come to agreement on what we will fund. So I think people need to understand that if you're trying to clean up an AOC, one of the first things you need to do is get all the appropriate people around the table to say, okay, you know what? These are the actions we need to take. And to be frank, it can't be an unlimited number of actions that addresses every single person's concern or every single person's private issue. Because as we all know, if you make that the standard, will you ever get done? Never. Won't happen. So, and I'm going to try, I'm going to stop exactly at 1 o'clock, so let me move on from AOCs. But I know there are people here who are working in AOCs. Ashtabula, I'm delighted to say, is an AOC where management actions have been completed. The work is finished after years. And those of you familiar with Ashtabula, I think know what a lift that was for so many people over so much time. We're not ready for delisting yet, but we have completed management actions. The healing has begun, and that's huge. We hope at some point, we don't know when, to get to the same stage with the Cuyahoga AOC, which you know is complex. I don't need to tell you that. And the Maumee, which is also an area not unfamiliar to you because of the algae blooms. Let's talk about algae. It is an understatement, again, to say that nutrient loadings in the Great Lakes, especially in a couple areas of the Great Lakes, are an enormous problem. The western basin of Lake Erie is probably the foremost example of that. Why? Because, as you know, it's very shallow. It warms up a lot because it is so shallow, and because it is situated right at the mouth of a very, very large watershed that includes a tremendous amount of agricultural production, which in turn translates into a tremendous amount of nutrient runoff. Now, let's be very candid here. This is not just an agricultural problem. This is an everything problem. This is everything from lawn fertilizers to nutrients running off from overland flow, from all sorts of things. But estimates are somewhere between 60 and 80% of the nutrients we anticipate or we estimate come out of the agricultural basin. Now, I was EPA director a number of years ago here in Ohio, and I can tell you I've been doing this work since I was 17 years old. I started in the Youth Conservation Corps back in 1976. I don't know if any of you remember that. I'm really dating myself. But I think there's been an understanding for many, many years that there's been a tension between agricultural production and environmental protection. My quick take on that is, as near as I can tell by looking at Ohio, that is improving, which is another reason why this is getting energized. Now, there are people here who are privy to the discussions that are going on in the state of Ohio and the government between the agencies and the ag community and the NGOs and other people. But there is a discussion. There is, I think, an increasing acknowledgement of, boy, this is a problem. If we're going to fix it, we all have to work together. And my sense is that's beginning to happen. I understand that state money is being made available for a number of activities pertaining to algae. That is wonderful news for us. We, through the GLRI, have spent close to $100 million, which we generally have spent by giving it to the Natural Resources Conservation Service to work with farmers to improve their agricultural practices. That's been a key source of money. Now, or a key source of funding. I would be lying if I stood up here and said, we think we're going to have this licked in a year, 2 years, 3 years. We do not know. And anyone who says they can tell you how quickly the nutrient problem is going to be addressed, if they tell you they know how long it's going to take, I don't think they're telling you straight. This is an enormous problem for a couple of reasons. One, now we're working on trying to slow down the amount of nutrients getting into the lake. As I said, we're working, all the agencies are working on that. That work is going to continue because we have to try to do that. And we have to find better ways to do that. We have to look for better ways to try to do that and get the biggest bang for the buck. It's a cliche, but it's accurate, to try to figure out how we're going to do that. And we don't have all the answers yet. But make no mistake, there is a tremendous amount of nutrients, most notably phosphorus, still flowing into the Western Basin. There's also a tremendous amount of phosphorus already in the Western Basin that, through internal cycling, is continuing to contribute to the problem. This is a very big lift. The one thing I do know, though, is that, like so many other things, you have to do something. You want to curse the darkness, light a candle. I think we have to keep focusing on what we can do. We are putting money into it. Do I think we're doing enough? What I would say is we're doing the best we can, but we have to figure out ways to try to do better. We have to try to do better. And everyone, all those constituencies that I just mentioned a few moments ago, have to continue talking, working together, being very candid, and trying to address this. This is not an easy fix. Some people will say, no problem, just regulate it. Okay, that's a tough lift. No problem, just plug up the phosphorus from the POTWs, the publicly owned treatment plants. Then someone will say, well, wait a minute, they're not the biggest source of the problem anyway. Oh, yes, they are. No, they're not. The discussion, a meaningful discussion based on the facts, needs to continue. It needs to continue. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that in a year, 2, 3, 4, we're going to have this problem licked. I still can't explain why, in 1995, after years of watching soluble phosphorus in Lake Erie, watching those levels decrease, right around 1995, they started to increase. And when that happened, guess what we started to see? The blooms. Was it climate related? I don't know. That's a theory. Did it have something to do with a change in agricultural practices? I don't know. I've yet to meet anybody who knows exactly why that's happened. But finding out why that's happened, I think is critical. Now, you may know we're doing a lot of work. We're doing a lot of work on Lake Erie this year. This is what we call our CSMI year. And I'm not going to hit you with a lot of acronyms today. It's our Comprehensive Science and Monitoring Initiative. This year, the subject of that initiative is Lake Erie. So there, in fact, the Lake Guardian was parked down at the 9th Street dock this morning. It just took off. I think it's having engine trouble. We've got to do a little work on the engines. But the Lake Guardian, our research vessel, will be patrolling Lake Erie a lot this summer, collecting data on all sorts of things, including phosphorus, as we continue to work on this problem. But this is a big lift. Some people, my staff who've been around for a long time, some of them say, it's funny because, or ironic, funny probably isn't the right word, we're getting to the point that we think we're actually making more progress on AOCs than we anticipated, and we're struggling with nutrients. And 10 years ago, people weren't paying as much attention to nutrients because the problem hadn't really exploded like it has now. 2011, you know, was a watershed year. I had the pleasure of being the director of Ohio EPA in 2010 when Grand Lake St. Mary's, which to me was sort of a pilot project, if you will, for what can happen when you've got too much nutrients and things go toxic. Never seen anything like that. Never seen shimmering waves of various types of blue-green algae. And you could literally watch it change color as the organisms multiplied and do whatever cyanobacteria do. Not something that I want to see again. We have to keep devoting a tremendous amount of resources to this. But again, it is safe to say everyone's energized. I have 5 minutes, and I'm going to stick to that. I'm going to talk briefly about invasives. Now, I'm not going to talk as much about invasive species except to say a couple of things. When I say invasive species, what does everyone think of? Asian carp. And you all know that you've read probably as much as I have about the Corps' study, and then folks were upset that, well, the study didn't really make any recommendations, and now is Congress going to have to weigh in and what's going to happen? So to say the least, there is a lot of energy on the Asian carp issue. States have filed lawsuits, you're aware of that. There's a tremendous amount of fear and concern over the Asian carp getting into the Great Lakes, which I share. Now, I live in Chicago, and if you know anything about invasive species, you know that one, perhaps the focal point of a potential major release is from the Des Plaines River. The Des Plaines River, and just a little geography here. If I had a map, indulge me for a second. Imagine a map, if you will, of the Great Lakes. So here's the Great Lakes. Now, you all know what a watershed is. The watershed is the area that drains into the Great Lakes, right? So here's the Great Lakes in my hand, and you can draw kind of a circle around my hand. That's the watershed around the Great Lakes. If you look, when you go back to your office, just don't tell your boss, but Google real quickly, Great Lakes watershed, and you'll see an excellent map of the lakes and the watershed that drains into them. There is one place where the Great Lakes watershed, the area that drains into the lakes, is within a mile of the lake itself. And you know where that is? Chicago. Because we are so close to the Mississippi basin there that in the old days, when that was first settled, the Chicago River was this little creek that you could paddle in, maybe a mile, half a mile. Then you walk through a swamp, and then you got to the Des Plaines River, which drains to the Mississippi. That's the area where people are primarily concerned about Asian carp breaking through, because geographically it's in such close proximity to Lake Michigan, which is why there are things like electric devices at the locks down in Lockport and other ways to keep those out. Now, I will be very candid, and I'm not trying to just punt this, but I'm going to punt this. The Great Lakes National Program Office, our role in invasive species is actually relatively minimal. We provide funding, but the leadership on on Asian carp issues really comes out of the CEQ, the Office, the Council for Environmental Quality, out of the White House. They're leading that effort. We're certainly involved, and to say the least, the Fish and Wildlife Service are huge players in that, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers, who was tasked with that enormous study. And the big issue now is complete and total ecological separation what you do. I would venture to say that a lot of people in this room would say absolutely. There's not even a discussion about that. You do that. Of course, one of the factors that will come up, what are the two questions again? How much? Who pays? That's a question that's going to have to be answered. But I think, to say the least, people are very, very, very energized on that. Now, with my 2 minutes, because I was told they would throw rolls at my head if I didn't stop at 1 o'clock. So I am going to stop at 1 o'clock. The Great Lakes are a wonder. Each lake is so different. Each lake has a different history, a different quality. Lake Superior is so different from Lake Erie. Their beauty is different, their ecology is different, their environment is different, and they are a treasure. Now, I didn't want to get into 21% of the world's freshwater. Those are critical facts, but that's not what I wanted to come here and talk about. I just wanted to talk about what a wonder this is. And I feel delighted to be working for the Great Lakes National Program Office at a time when there is meaningful funding, which hasn't always been the case. There is significant, meaningful funding with bipartisan support because people realize we need to try to restore and remediate these lakes. These lakes supply jobs. They supply an economy. They supply recreational opportunities. They supply an aesthetic that's, of course, that's, where's that in the Maslow pyramid? But it's, the beauty is critical to us. Yeah, it's up there. So we have to take care of these, and I'm going to close just by saying I'm delighted to tell you the state of the Great Lakes today, June 11th, 2014, is energized, and in part it's energized by and because of you. And with that, I'll stop and take questions. Thank you.
Well done. I don't think the Great Lakes are the only thing that are energized right now. I am Dan Moulthrop. I'm the Chief Executive here at the City Club with a little bit of housekeeping. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a Friday forum featuring, as you know, Chris Korleski, Director of the Great Lakes National Program Office at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We're going to return to our speaker momentarily for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We encourage all of you, guests and City Club members, to formulate questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions need only be two things: brief and actually questions. We welcome all of you here and those joining us through our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, 104.9 WCLV, WVIZ PBS, all of which means IdeaStream, or on WTAM or one of the many other radio stations across the country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, July 18th, the City Club welcomes U.S. Senator Rob Portman. For more information about that program or any of our upcoming or past programs, please visit our brand new website, cityclub.org. Today's program is sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, Great Lakes Brewing Company, and the Great Lakes Science Center. We thank you all very much for your support in making today's programming possible. We also want to recognize our community partners, Cleveland Lakefront Parks Conservancy, the Cleveland Water Alliance, and the Ohio Environmental Coalition. Thank you all for your support. Today, we also welcome guests at tables hosted by the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, the Great Lakes Brewing Company, Great Lakes Science Center, Cleveland Cuyahoga County Port Authority, the Cleveland Lakefront Parks Conservancy, Senator Rob Portman, the Nature Conservancy, and the Cleveland Water Alliance. Thank you all for your support. Now, it's time for your questions. We welcome questions from everyone, as I said, including guests. Holding our microphones today are marketing and outreach specialist Kirsten Pianka and one of our City Club interns, Spencer Kiesel. Our first question, please. Over this way.
Mr. Korleski, it's been known for, right here.
Thank you.
Time that passenger ships that come into the Great Lakes, in addition to dropping off their passengers, often drop off other things in the Great Lakes, which harm the purity and the things you've been talking about today. What steps can be taken to prevent passenger ships from polluting the Great Lakes?
That's an excellent question, and there are a lot of things that are being done. So let me use the drycenid mussels as an example. That's a fancy word for the zebra mussels, and then the one that came after, whose name escapes me right now. Thank you, the quagga mussels. Thank you. Everybody knows, of course, the quagga. So that's a perfect example of what you're talking about, because those organisms derive from the Caspian Sea area in Central Europe, and they hitchhike their way over here on probably industrial freighters and possibly passenger ships as well. They made their way slowly down the St. Lawrence, ultimately got into the lakes, and to say the least, they had a huge impact on the Great Lakes ecosystem. You all remember in the 80s and 90s, remember when the water started to clear up, and people were like, wow, this is a great thing. The water's starting to look so clear. And then you realize, but where's the fish that it was a big problem. Since then, we've at least become a lot more aware. US EPA, not my office, but our Office of Water, has been working along with Canada and a number of other entities on ballast water treatment technologies, because a lot of those organisms, they catch a ride, and again, on any kind of ship, in the ballast water. And they're trying to do things now. It can include radiation, chlorination. There's a variety of things to do, and I would be lying if I said I'm an expert on this. And recently, US EPA passed a ballast water rule, or they're working on a ballast water rule to better regulate that. So for the industrial ships, the freighters, I think they're making progress. Now, passenger ships, commercial boats, fishing boats, even recreational boats are also a problem, because they can move. All it takes is someone to catch something that you don't want. Keep it in a bait bucket, you put it in your live well. When you get to wherever you're going, you drive back home, you dump it into the local creek or drain right by the lake, and then you've just contaminated a new lake with this species. So we have actually funded things, for example, where there are boat inspection stations that when you drive away from, in the Adirondacks, for example, when you drive away from parts of the Adirondack Park, there are college students who will come out And look at your live well, make sure there's nothing in there, make sure you've drained what you need to drain. And it's primarily education to tell people, we call them aquatic hitchhikers. Please don't let these hitchhikers hitch a ride with you. So we have boat inspection stations, we have boat draining stations, but the big emphasis is on trying to educate both commercial fisher folks as well as recreational fisher folks. It's easy for these things to get in. They're very easy to move. Be very careful and pay attention to what you're moving. So it is an area, and why do I say these things? My staff will tell you that as best as we can tell, we have not had a new invasive for about 6 years. We hope that continues, at least in this part of the lakes. But it's not just creatures, it's not just organisms like fish or bugs, plants. Everyone here knows what Phragmites are. They've been around for a very long time. Cattails and hydrilla, which is a water plant that can choke channels and close up boating areas and so forth. We are also spending a lot of money working with people in the Corps of Engineers to try to scoop out areas where hydrilla has taken over. You can do that, but then the question is, how do you keep them from coming back once they're in an ecosystem? And that's a much tougher question.
Right here. Mr. Korleski, thank you for a very well-organized and practical speech. And with an eye to the practicality of it, I ask you to explain a term you used, which I've never heard before, which was tough lift. And I think you referred to it, you used it to refer to a program that would need to get started and need to find funding and need to take place if a problem is going to be addressed in an effective and forceful way. But if I'm wrong, you can tell me. Well, wait.
Okay.
The question is,
okay.
Who is the lifter? Is it your agency? Is it the general public? Is it President Obama? Who does the tough lift?
So first, what I mean, I think your definition, my definition of tough lift is a little more general than what you just described, so let me answer that first. A tough lift to me is just it's a colloquial phrase I use to mean a lot of work, a big job. It's something that's going to be difficult to accomplish. That's all I mean by a tough lift. Your more pertinent question about, well, who does it? My general answer, as a recovering lawyer, so I haven't shed all my old habits, is it depends. It depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish. But I think the better answer is when you're dealing with something like this, to ultimately accomplish some of these tough lifts, it's going to require everyone. It's going to require the cooperation of numerous government agencies, including, in many instances, cooperation between our federal government and the Canadian governments, cooperation between the states and Canadian provinces, local government, again, tribes. I know tribes that was sort of a foreign concept to me because we don't have tribal entities here. We definitely have them in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. So they're involved, tribal equivalents in Canada, and I think it's critical to have the lifting, the work of the local public. People can get involved in so many ways. AOCs, there are public advisory councils that people staff. That's a key example. But at the end of the day, if you're talking about funding, which is a big part of any tough lift in order, I think, to get it done, I think you really are talking about large public support. Because in the absence of large public support, things don't tend to go very far in terms of federal dollars, et cetera, even state dollars, local dollars, et cetera. So my general answer is a tough lift has to be done by everybody, but again, it would depend on the specific circumstances. But again, to make this work with this huge work list we have to accomplish, the more the better. Which makes it difficult because then you're hearing from more people and it takes a lot of time, a lot of what's the old transactional costs, et cetera. But at the end of the day, if you get more buy-in, it makes it easier.
We do have one
tribe. And I don't know who that is.
Cleveland Indians.
Who's LeBron James? And I'm sorry as an aside, and I know I shouldn't do this, but we've got a few minutes. I'm going to come clean with you folks. You're looking at a guy who gave up sports 25 years ago. And let me explain why. Because people, not sports, what's wrong with you? And, I hear all the comments about, are you a man, blah, 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 blah. So about 25 years ago, I was a regular Joe. Saturdays was the Buckeyes. Sundays was, I will say, the Browns. I'm from Northeast Ohio, not that other team located further down south whose name escapes me. And then, I don't remember exactly why, but when Saturday was tied up, I didn't do that. And you know what I realized? Oh my God, my weekend just got 3 days longer. I can do other things. I can do, so anyway, I gave up sports. That's why I'm so out of the lingo, but it's been a blessing for me. So mock me if you will, but I don't do sports anymore, so. All right, I'm sorry, I totally digress.
Mr. Director, over here. Other way.
There we go, thank you.
The problem of agricultural runoff is not unique to the Great Lakes. I'm thinking particularly of the Croton Reservoir in New York, which supplies most of the drinking water to Manhattan. Same problem there. You've already said we're not sure about what the cause of the additional problem from agricultural runoff is. My question is, given the fact that it occurs in many places in the United States, and I presume there are many agencies that are trying to address this problem, what coordination of effort is there to identify the problem?
That is an excellent question. I love to say that. Normally I say, that's an excellent question, thank you, and then I go, next question, but I'm going to try to answer that. I think as recently as within the last 2 weeks, I'm not sure if the president has signed it yet. Some of you might know, Jack might know. There was a bill passed, and it either has become law or it will become law, and I forget the name, but it's the harmful algal, I don't remember the name of the statute itself. But what it does is, in large part, it is trying to drive that coordinating effort. Now, it's been around before. This was an update. And what it does generally is it puts NOAA in charge of trying to better coordinate algae research, algae response activities so that people are talking to each other. One notable exception in the bill is that for freshwater, it gives the EPA administrator considerable authority. Not unlimited and ultimate authority over freshwater water like the Great Lakes. But that is, I think, a good place to start. The other thing that's happening under this GLRI, and again, that's not the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, is Congress's funding. That's that funding that I alluded to earlier. Under the GLRI, because we have 16 agencies there, that, including the Corps of Engineers, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Fish and Wildlife Service, that has helped us do a better job of getting feel for algae problems nationwide. There are, from your question I can tell, you know that there are, the Great Lakes is not the only federal, what we call a regional program. There's a program for the Chesapeake Bay, for the Gulf of Mexico, for other areas, that they also, just like we do, have to deal with this algae problem. Now, I don't talk to the folks in the Great Lakes program very much. That may change under this legislation. It's unclear to me yet, like any legislation, what the logistical and practical fallout of that will be. But that tells me a couple of things. And I think Senator Portman's going to be here next week. I think he was a huge sponsor and may, in fact, have been the driving force behind getting this thing reauthorized. But I think a big driving factor behind it was to try to bring in better consolidation than we have now. And again, we'll see. But I think that legislation will help. It also provided $25 million, something to that effect, to try to give that some gasoline and make it go somewhere.
Do you think it's better to have as many nonprofits in the area of water quality and sustainability, or do you think it's better to avoid a lot of redundancies and coalesce their energies so you could have one more united, powerful front?
That is such a good question, and I'm going to answer it very honestly. Thank you. Next question. It is very difficult to deal with, and we all know this, regardless of what you do, when you're dealing with a number of entities that have similar goals and similar objectives. It's much more difficult. It's more complicated because you have, for example, you could have the same people making the same requests or with the same wish list, and you're spending time working with a number of different entities. That makes it harder than if you had sort of one monolithic NGO that dealt with this. That would make it easier. But this being the United States, for which I am eternally grateful, I think having that variety, because people are going to have different issues depending on, the old phrase, where you stand depends on where you sit. I think that's very, very true. And I also think, this just being the good old USA, I think it's important to have people represent their local concerns and voice those local concerns so that they're sure that their particular concerns are heard. So theoretically, or my answer is, I think it's important that we have a number of voices raising their concerns, because you get, I think, a better set of issues and probably a better understanding of what's going on. But there's no question that logistically it makes everything harder. There's just no question. But much as I might like to say, no, we just need one monolithic, in my independent, speaking only for myself, I think it's good to have those various voices out there. Now, to the extent they want to work amongst themselves, and that would be wonderful. I would certainly encourage that, but I think we need that various input.
But it doesn't necessarily mean just one monolithic. It could be still coalescing various groups to make fewer.
Sure. Sure. No, I agree. And then we hear you, but gentleman back here?
I appreciate very much the way that you've presented the management of the Great Lakes in the current context. I'm wondering, how do you anticipate the management of the Great Lakes will change in a global climate changing context?
Also an excellent question. If you've read the National Climate Assessment that came out not that long ago, and if you've been reading any newspaper, you know that the President of the United States and the Administrator of EPA is making climate change a fundamental priority. It is Gina McCarthy's, if it's not her #1 priority, I don't know what is. And as we all know, that is extremely controversial, and et cetera, et cetera. I think, like everybody else, I'm not a scientist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but reading the work of US EPA, the National Climate Assessment, all the work that's being done, in my mind, there's no question that climate change is a real, urgent, and I can't think of what clear, urgent, and I can't remember what the other word is. It's something that has to be taken into account. I do think there is no question that if the projections, and they are projections, and even the people making the projections acknowledge that there has to be a degree of error and latitude, anyone who is being pinpoint specific about what will happen when and what exactly is causing what in what fashion, I think the best scientists are saying, we don't know everything. We're doing the best we can. But yes, I think there will be an impact on the Great Lakes. And let me give you an example of how we're trying to deal with that. So we fund 2,000 projects. It's actually more than that now, but the GLRI has funded over 2,000 projects. Well, one of the things that we're thinking about is, okay, climate change. What are we going to do? How do we deal with it? Well, one of the ways that we want to deal with it is every GLRI project is an investment of taxpayer dollars. And like all good stewards of taxpayer dollars, we want to make sure that that money is invested wisely. So if you're going to fund a GLRI project, whatever it is, it could be, and this is my favorite example. Let's say you're going to do a habitat restoration project where you're restoring habitat, let's say somewhere up in northern Michigan. Whereas 20 years ago, probably longer than that, it may have been, oh, you know what, we'll plant what grows there now, which is, sprucey-like trees. That's a really unscientific way to say that, but my apologies. But like evergreens, evergreens, cold weather trees. Would you plant those trees today if you were doing a habitat project? No, because the fear is the climate is changing such that cold weather species, they're not going to do well. So you think about things like we need to think about changing our species allocation to say if we're going to do habitat projects, we better be mindful of warm weather species that are going to be able to adapt and be there for a while, because the last thing we want to do is pay for a habitat project, and these can be very expensive, only to have them impacted by climate change that impacts the viability and the duration of the project and the effectiveness of the project. So, I mean, that's, I think, a very obvious example where we and our federal partners and everyone is trying to think about how do you anticipate and how do you prepare for? What kind of resiliency do you build into the system? But it's very much on our mind. And yes, we do think there's no question that it's going to get warmer, and we have to take that into account. Now, I'll go wherever the microphone goes.
Thank you. Many people in this room are focused on the delisting and finishing the management actions for the Cuyahoga area of concern. And we're really energized now because we have a deadline, which is the year 2019, the 50th anniversary of the last time the river burned. And at that time, the international media will be coming to Cleveland to find out what's happened with the Cuyahoga River. Sure. So we want to make sure we have a great story to tell. So what can you and your office do to help galvanize this community to make sure we meet that deadline and get the management actions complete by the year 2019?
So here's, I think, the number one thing I can do is I can look at everyone in this room and I can say, those of you who are involved in the Cuyahoga RAP, that's the Remedial Action Plan, talk extensively with Ohio EPA, because we talk extensively with Ohio EPA and the local PAC to a certain extent, but most of our involvement is back and forth with Ohio EPA. I've conveyed the message to them. My staff has conveyed the message to Ohio EPA, and I'm a fan of Ohio EPA for obvious reasons. But the message is, work very hard on coming to, if you can, if at all possible, an agreed upon list of activities that will, in everyone's judgment, result in the completion of management activities that will ultimately lead to the AOC delisting. One of the things that we've struggled with historically, and I think in large part this is because we didn't have the money that we have in this wonderful time period, which, and let me just point out to everybody, especially the lawyers in the room, GLRI, there is no GLRI statute. If you look up GLRI in a statute, it doesn't exist. We live and die from year to year based on the strength of our congressional appropriation. That's just the reality. So from year to year, we don't know what our funding is going to be. But my point is, just given that reality, the sooner that people can come to an agreement, and assuming we concur with that, and there will be discussions back and forth, then we can start figuring out, okay, we have a roadmap. Now, how do we fund it? What comes first? How do we tie together dredging activities with habitat restoration activities? But as long as it's just people talking, and boy, wouldn't it be great if we could do that? And you know, this person, they're worried about this. It's stuck. Because at the end of the day, like any other job, you ultimately have to agree. And it's not easy, but you have to try to agree on this will get us there. There are other things that would be great. They would be nice. We would all like to see those things done. But are they critical to the ultimate delisting of the AOC? That's the acid test that I think has to be applied. And that's what I would do. I tell everyone in the Great Lakes that same statement. Work very hard to come to an agreement on the work that has to be done to remove the impairments.
Yes, and thank you again for coming. An
Oh,
excellent
you're very
presentation and wonderful questions answered as well. I wanted to ask you, though, about the status and strength of the Great Lakes Compact, because I've just heard recently that a judge in the Southwest has ordered Arizona to reduce its water withdrawal from the Colorado by about a third. And I think the technology has progressed somewhat for diversions out of the Great Lakes. So where are we there, and can we continue to withstand draining our lakes for other uses?
That is an excellent question, and unfortunately, I'm not the person who has a good answer. And the reason is we don't deal with compact issues. We're the water quality agencies. But at least let me tell you what I think. So if the idea of the compact was to make it very clear that the Great Lakes are a wonderful source of water and there's a concern about diverting that outside the basin with the deleterious impacts that could have, et cetera, that's a concern. I think it's very likely, and I think most people in this room who are aware of what's happening in the Southwest, where water is becoming such a pressing issue, as well as other parts of the world, it is not inconceivable to me that at some point someone's going to go, look at all that water. Look at all that water. Now, that becomes a political question. I stay out of politics. I'm not a political person. I'm a career person. But I think it's, if people continue to experience drought to the same extent and for a duration of time, it's very possible that people are going to start looking around for other supplies of water. I don't know enough about the language of the compact. It's not something that I ever spent much time on. So I really am going to plead a certain degree of ignorance on this issue. And if I try to answer it based on the language of the compact, I would be making it up. And I don't want to do that. Well, oh, absolutely. There's no question. Absolutely, there's no question about that. But I would have to leave a discussion of the compact and what it requires to people who know it better than I do. So I'm sorry.
Thank you. Great talk, Chris. Question about the GLRI money. We see a lot of money going to habitat restoration, dredging projects, best management practices on agricultural fields. Just a little bit of your insight possibly in where you think funding might be available in the future for just basic monitoring going into the future.
Okay, that is a great question. And it raises, these are all great questions. I mean, I'll tell you what, you've been downtown before. I can see this. You're hitting on an issue that is actually and has been a source of some tension in the Great Lakes community in this sense. One of the things that I know my approach and my focus, and I think my boss's focus as well, is we have money, our primary activity should be use it for restoration and remediation. Make things better. Now, there are some folks who would say, I think legitimately, well, okay, that's great, but you have to be doing some amount of monitoring to see, using an adaptive management. I put quotes around it because it's used so much it's losing meaning, I fear. But using adaptive management, you have to know how you're doing. You have to see, are you having an impact? And to do that, you need to do some degree of monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. So the fight, that's probably too strong a word. The issue becomes how much of GLRI money goes to monitoring activities versus pure remediation and restoration work. And quite candidly, that is an issue that we deal with on almost a daily basis. That's something that we talk about extensively with our other agencies, because some of our agencies, to say the least, are extremely data-driven, very science-driven. We all are. But agencies like NOAA, agencies like USGS, they rely very, very heavily on monitoring. So I think this is sort of the same analogy as it's not a question of either or. You either have economic development or you have environmental improvement. I think that mindset rightfully is going by the wayside. People realize you actually need both. That's my view on this. The issue becomes when you get down to the particular, what about this particular monitoring project? Should we fund that or should we fund some restoration activity? That's when sometimes people have legitimate disagreements.
Today at the City Club, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Chris Korleski, Director of the Great Lakes National Program Office. Thank you, Mr. Korleski, for that inspiring State of the Great Lakes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The program is now adjourned.